You're listening to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast, episode 220. Welcome to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. I'm your host, Paula Price, lawyer turned certified executive coach. This podcast was created to empower women lawyers just like you to create a life and practice you love. Join me every week for a break from the hustle so we can focus on you, what you truly want, and how you can create it. If you're over the overwhelm, done with putting out fires, and ready to redefine success on your own terms, you're in the right place. Ready for today's episode? Let's dive in. Have you ever heard the expression, work smarter, not harder, and thought to yourself, yes, that is what I want? Today, we are taking that concept, not of working smarter, but of thinking smarter. Because what I would love to offer to you are three tools, three mindset shifts or thinking strategies that you can use to create more of what you want and less of what you don't want without adding effort or thinking time, but by thinking in a way that is more focused and strategic, and by not thinking in ways that may not lead to the results that you want, but that burn up energy. So today's episode, in a way, is inspired by some of the reading and podcast listening that I've been doing recently. So I've recently started reading a book. It's written by Dr. Joe Dispenza, and it's called Breaking the Habit of Being Yourself. It's a really interesting book. I'm not finished the book. I've started reading it, and I've been listening to podcast episodes that he has produced. Some of them are interviews, some of them are meditations. I've also followed a thread to Neville Goddard, who is described as a writer and mystic who was born in Bermuda and lived in the US in the early 1900s, who is known for manifesting and for the power of the human imagination to create their external worlds. And so it's a little bit going down that path of spirituality, of creating, using your ideas to create what you want in your environment. Dr. Dispenza's work is really interesting because he bridges the gap between spirituality and science. So he brings in quantum physics and neuroscience and biochemistry. And so it's really interesting to think about how the way in which we use our minds have impacts on the material world around us. And so that's where I'm coming from in recording today's episode. And so I love that we are able to use our minds strategically. We are conscious beings who have control over how and what we choose to think. And so today's episode is really about giving you some strategic tools, some practical, tangible tools that you can use so that you're using your mind more effectively. And as lawyers, using your mind is part of your job, and it's a huge part of your job. And so hopefully some of these techniques will help you navigate some of the challenges that you're having and pursue opportunities that you want to pursue in a way that feels more aligned, more focused, more strategic, and effective. So with that, we're going to dive in. I've got three different strategies that I'm going to offer to you today. I'm going to describe what the concept is, how problems can arise, and then offer solutions. And the solutions really are practical thinking strategies that you can apply. And as we go through these, I would love for you to think about how you can apply them in your day-to-day life, whether it's in your legal practice, whether it's outside of work. So have fun with these concepts and see what you find as you apply them. I mean, the beautiful thing about thinking is that you're not investing in a bunch of equipment that you have to buy and then test and see whether it works. This is all work that you can do internally. And you've probably heard expressions before about how when you rewire your thinking or when you change the way that you think about things, you'll start to notice that your world starts to shift around you. And that can be remarkable. And so hopefully some of these tools will help you do that. So the first of the three tools that I would love to offer to you is about picking your battles carefully. So I mentioned that I was listening to some podcasts, and some of them are with Neville Goddard. And to be honest, these are recorded I don't even know what decades. So they're kind of scratchy. They sound like, they've been on a record and someone took the record and recorded it into some digital format. And so it sounds scratchy and kind of old. And you can tell it's of a different generation. But some of what he says is really interesting. And one of the phrases that stopped me in my tracks, literally, was when he uttered the words that what you fight against grows stronger. Now, this literally stopped me in my tracks. I paused the podcast, I rewound it, and I listened to that part of it. What you fight against grows stronger. And the reason it struck me is that I've heard different versions of this, and likely you have too. You might have heard what you resist persists. That idea that when you fight something, it continues on and fights against you, or you resist it, it continues to press against you. Or you may have heard the expression where your focus goes, your energy flows. If you think about focusing on the problem, it's like your energy is focused on the problem when it could be focused on a solution. Now, you might have also heard this in a different format in terms of what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. If you think about some of the challenges that you've had, and maybe you've heard that expression before, again, it's this idea that this thing that is challenging you is actually making you stronger. So when you are fighting against something else, you're actually making that thing stronger. And literally, it stopped me in my tracks, and I thought, okay, so what is it that I'm currently fighting in my life that I'm actually strengthening by fighting against it? And you see this play out in real life. If you think about athletes and how they learn and how they get better at their sport, they typically will pair themselves against more accomplished adversaries because they learn from them, right? If you're a tennis player and you want to play a better tennis game, you're not going to go find the worst tennis player and then challenge them to a match. You're going to want to level up your game by finding people who are at your level, or preferably at a higher level. The same is true professionally. If you think about the files that you work on, if you're a litigator, for example, you might find that when you are paired against a more accomplished lawyer, someone who's been around longer than you and who maybe is more skilled than you are, then you see yourself as having to rise to the challenge and become better yourself. If you think about what happens when somebody reviews your work and they challenge your work product becomes better, you get better at doing the thing. If you think about AI, for example, one of the arguments I've heard recently about why you should not use AI as much, you should not rely on it for thinking and problem solving entirely. It's because if AI does the work, let's say you pose a question into AI and it generates a response for you, your brain has not engaged in the problem solving exercise. You yourself have not become mentally stronger or smarter as a result of having to solve a problem. And so you want the problem because the problem requires that you grow stronger to overcome it. So here, the thinking trap, the problem, the idea here, the concept is that when you are in your day-to-day, whether it's your professional work, whether it's outside of work, your personal relationships, maybe it's your family members, who knows? If you find yourself fighting, if you find yourself in battle, you want to ask yourself whether this is a battle that you want to engage in. Is it worth your energy? Is it worth your focus? And are you inadvertently strengthening the other side? And this is really easy to see. If you've ever witnessed any other people bicker, if you've got family members who bicker, maybe you've got parents who bicker, you can see it. You can see how one person will assert a position and the other person will get defensive. And as Byron Katie says, the first act of war is defense. So if you find yourself getting defensive, you have entered into war. You are now strengthening the other person in terms of helping them come up with better arguments as to why you're in the wrong and they are in the right. It's easy to see when other people are doing it. It's less obvious when you are the one who is in the middle of the battle. So what do you do here? What is the strategy? How do you deal with situations where you're inadvertently strengthening your opponent or strengthening the thing you're trying to avoid because you're engaged in battle with it. So the first thing is just to notice where you are fighting battles. And some of those battles you might decide are battles that you are going to fight. And so there is a time and place for that. The common law system is based on that whole adversarial system of here's one argument, here's the opposite argument. And in theory, when we both put our best arguments forward, we end up with the best solution. The best case ultimately is going to win. So there are some times where you will want to engage in a full-on battle. And there are likely many times where the battle simply isn't worth it. So you might think of, I've got kids, so my mind always goes to, what are some of the battles that I'm fighting? Bedtime, for example, or screen time, or do I really need to force them to eat the meal that I prepared for them? It's like you start digging in your heels, they start digging in their heels, they strengthen in their position, you strengthen in yours. So the solution is to notice, to choose your battles carefully, and instead of fighting, if you've chosen not to fight, is to accept. Let's just accept that this is going to happen. So if we use kids for an example, my kids are not going to want to go to bed when I ask them to. And so instead of fighting them on that, maybe I just accept, yeah, you don't want to go to bed. That's fine. I'm going to go to bed. You can let yourself up into your room whenever it feels right to you. I mean, right now we're recording this podcast, or I'm recording this episode in the middle of summer. We're on a summer schedule, so I'm not having any battles over bedtime. I'm just going to bed when I go to bed. They can go to bed when they want. They're at an age where I feel comfortable with that. Now, you might think, okay, but what about examples in the workplace? I often see people battling in terms of, let's say that you're a lawyer and you've got a difficult opposing counsel on a file, and, there are certain standards that lawyers need to adhere to. And so if it's a scenario where somebody that you're working opposite on a file is offside, that's one thing. But if it's a mere annoyance, or it's a battle that you could fight, or maybe you're not fighting that battle with them, but you're turning to your colleague and saying, oh, can you believe that so-and-so sent me this letter and look at what they said? You are indirectly fighting against them. And so do you want to do that, right? Do you want to strengthen that, or do you want to accept it? And so you might just accept, yeah, that's how lawyers are. When you are in battle, when you're writing these letters, that's what happens. And I'm just going to accept that as a part of it. Now, another tool, in addition to accepting that this is just how it is, and I'm going to roll with it, I'm not going to fight against it. Actually, if you play that one out, let's say you do have a letter that you receive from opposing counsel. You do have that option. Like, let's say you do choose to engage in that battle. Are you really moving the case forward? Maybe sometimes it is entirely appropriate to have that battle. Other times it might not be appropriate to have that battle. So you really want to be asking yourself, does it make sense? Am I strengthening somebody else's position, or am I actually getting the thing that I want? So again, we're just thinking from that concept of we're strengthening whatever we fight against. Do we want to engage in that fight? Now, another tool that is a version of acceptance is to see the truth in it, right? Is to see the truth in what somebody is saying. So let's say you are having a discussion with a loved one and they say to you, Paula, you're being really inflexible here. Then my instinct might be to argue and say, well, no, I'm not being inflexible. You're being inflexible. And chances are there's some truth in both of those things. If you imagine a hypothetical where someone is saying that about you, or could be some other thing. I'm picking inflexible because it's plausible. I can absolutely see that happening. And yeah, I've probably had conversations where people have told me that I'm being inflexible. And so instead of fighting against that, then what you can do is to acknowledge that, yes, I am inflexible. I am being inflexible here. And sometimes I am inflexible. And what that does, again, is that it releases the tension. It now is no longer a battle, it's a concession. Yeah, sometimes I am. And then you get to move forward. So you can see how that would, in perhaps an example that would be relevant to you, maybe that's an example you can relate to, you can see how accepting it is not strengthening. Now we've kind of addressed it. Okay, now we can move forward. And so you're not building up, you're not strengthening. That person isn't then coming up with more examples. Well, you're inflexible here, and there. You're like, no, I get it. I see it. I can totally see it. So it's almost like a relief there, right? You've acknowledged that, yes, this does happen sometimes. And then
here, finally, what I'd recommend doing is to refocus your energy. So, the acceptance part of it, again, this is not to say that you always should accept that things are a certain way, but if you've chosen that route, right? You've chosen to accept, maybe you've decided to acknowledge that, yeah, there is some truth here. Focus your attention instead of focusing your attention on the battle, the strengthening of your opponent. What is it you actually want here? And that might require a notional step back and looking at the bigger picture. What is it that you're trying to accomplish here? If it's the resolution of your client's case, what are you really trying to solve here? And what role does this letter exchange play in that grand scheme, right? If it's a discussion with a loved one about what you're going to do on the weekend, what is it that you want to do? Where is that lack of flexibility coming into play? And what is the real objective? Because what you want to do is shift your attention away from the problem toward the solution. And so by allowing that, by not engaging in the battle, by not taking that first step of war, defending, that frees up your energy and your focus to look at what you actually want to create. So again, going back to that first tool then that we're offering is when it comes to thinking smarter, not harder, we're not going to go down that rabbit hole of defending ourselves. That would be working harder and not necessarily getting what we want. Instead, what we're doing is we are going to go down that path of what is it that I really want here and what is the clearest way to get there. Second strategy. So the second strategy that I would love to offer to you when it comes to thinking smarter, not harder, is to stop waiting for milestones or other external events in order to feel happy, successful, accomplished, proud, confident, whatever feeling it is that you are trying to get to, whatever result it is that you are trying to create. And the trap here is that when you delay, I've talked about this on the podcast before. I first heard this concept or something similar to it when I was listening to a talk that was given by Sean Achor. He is a happiness professor or academic who studies happiness. I believe he was at Stanford. He has a really well-known TED Talk. And he talked about this idea of moving goalposts, that if you are hinging your happiness, your feeling of success on the accomplishment of a certain event in the future, then yes, you may feel really happy when you reach that milestone. Maybe it's graduating law school, maybe it's winning a case, maybe it's settling a file, maybe it's closing a deal. You will be happy when, and then you will be. Studies have shown there will be this uptick in your level of happiness. But over time, you're going to go back to a base level of happiness. And so the idea of depending on that external thing to happen in order to feel a certain way means that you are more often than not in that state of not being happy because that thing hasn't happened yet. And so what I'm encouraging you to think about here in terms of the thinking trap and the more strategic thinking is that we want to start noticing where we are waiting for something else to happen in order to feel a certain way, in order to feel good. And one of the problems here is that if you are constantly waiting for that external thing to happen, that event in the future to happen, you become a person who is never actually satisfied. And if you are satisfied, it's short-lived. So again, I mentioned this book that Dr. Joe Dispenza wrote about breaking the habit of being yourself and how he's bridging the gap between spirituality and science, how he talks about quantum physics, and he talks about manifesting, about how you create ideas in your mind and then you go out and you create that in reality. And he has an explanation that is rooted in quantum physics. It's a little bit much for me to explain on the podcast, but one of the ideas is that if you're thinking about what it is that you want, he encourages you to really embody the feeling of already having that thing and then to act from the place, to take action from that place of already having what it is that you want. And the reason for that is that if you are imagining yourself who is a person who wants to have that thing, who is chasing that thing, who doesn't yet have that thing, then that is what you will create. If you imagine that you're a person who doesn't yet have the thing that you want, then you'll continue to perpetuate actions that reflect that person. So if you think right now about something that you want in your life, maybe it's a health goal, maybe it's a professional goal, maybe it's a relationship goal, you don't yet have that thing. That goal is outside of you. And so if you continue to be the person that you are, this is kind of following on that idea of breaking the habit of being yourself. If you continue to follow the same patterns, the same habits, the same ways of thinking, then you create the same results. And the idea then is that if you can step into the version of you who has already created the thing that you wanted, then your actions are going to align with the person who has already achieved that thing. And a shorthand that he gives for that, which I think is useful, is to practice being grateful for the thing already having happened. And I like his explanation for that is because typically when we express gratitude for the things we already have. Thank you for my health. Thank you for my children. Thank you for my professional work. Thank you for the clients that I had. Thank you for the experience of whatever it is. These are things typically that you already have. And what he's inviting us to think about is gratitude for something that you don't yet have. And the theory there is that you're then aligning yourself with the energy of the person who has already accomplished that. And as I explain this to you, what I'm hoping is that you're thinking in your mind about what the differences would be. If you were already in possession of that thing that you really want, what would be different about you? How would you be thinking differently? How would you be acting differently? You would no longer be pursuing that thing. You would already have it. And so what would that mean for you? So that I think is a really interesting way of thinking about success, thinking about how you want to feel, thinking about the person that you want to be in the world, is to put yourself in that position of what would it be like if you already had that thing? Now, this comes up as well with confidence, for example, or success, or feeling a certain way. So often I'll work with lawyers who feel like they haven't quite yet reached the level of success that they want, or they're looking to an external event in order to prove to themselves that they are successful or that they are confident. And so this allows you, if you start to flip the switch around, then you can actually be before you have the thing. And this is where the tool comes in. And the tool that I think is probably the most practical for doing this exercise, especially for lawyers who are likely thinking about this in terms of an external achievement. Maybe it's a new job, maybe it's winning a case, maybe it's a promotion at work. There's probably some tangible thing that you can think of. And the way that I like to frame this is the be, do, have model, which I've spoken about on the podcast before. There's a full episode dedicated to it. I use this model quite often with coaching clients, especially when clients come to me and they're really focused on, what do I need to do here in order to create the result? And they're focused very much on what are the action steps. And I 100% endorse taking action toward your goal. But before that, what I think is key is to be really thoughtful about the who. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in the third tool, the third strategy. But the be, do, have model is basically flipping around the way that we normally think about things into a model that allows you to be first, then do, then have. So if we were to break this down and think about how we normally approach a problem, let's say we want to go to law school to become a lawyer. And the reason we want to become a lawyer is we want to feel competent, confident, all that. And yes, there is a certain licensing requirement to be an actual lawyer. But it's an example that I think is probably relatable. Another example might be getting a promotion at work. So what we might think about there is, there's a title that you want and you want to have that role. And so you think, well, I have to have that role in order to do the things that I want and have the results, have that feeling that I want. So a traditional approach then is that we think we need to do, have, and be. We need to do the things. We need to get the promotion, or we do the work of having the promotion so that we can be the person who has the result that you want. So I need to do the thing to have the result so that I can be happy, right? If we go back to the Sean Acor example, I need to do the work to win the case so that I can be happy with the result. I can feel confident. So that's kind of one way of looking at it. And I would say that's probably the most typical way that we think about things. The be, do, have model flips around the script so that we start with the be. That means we have to be the person who is confident, who is competent, who feels successful even before the title comes along. And from that place, that be state, that's when you do the thing. So you take the action from the position of already having accomplished the goal. So yes, if you're going to law school, you don't yet have your degree as a lawyer, but you can imagine if that's the goal that you have in mind, that you can say, okay, if I already had my law degree, how would I be dealing with this particular situation? What would I do differently? So you want to be thinking about, or if I was already a lawyer, or if I was a professional, or if I was confident, if I was successful, how would I approach this problem or this challenge or this opportunity differently from how I am currently, if you're not seeing yourself as those things yet. So you want to be the person who has a result. You want to do the things that aligned and inspired action, and that in turn will create the results. So if we use an example of getting promoted at work, you might think, okay, here I am, I'm a senior associate. What I really want is to make partner. Or maybe you're working in an environment where you have an opportunity to step into a leadership role. There's a management position, your title would change, your role would change. And so what you can do is, instead of waiting for the official process to unfold, you might think about, okay, if I was already in that promoted role, if I was already partner, what would be different about the way that I carry myself in my practice? And maybe you're delegating more, maybe you're taking on more responsibility, maybe you're speaking with your clients and your colleagues with a sense of greater authority. Maybe you're holding yourself differently. Maybe you're taking more of a leadership role on files. Maybe you're building up more, you're doing more mentoring. Maybe you're getting involved in more leadership opportunities through committee work or whatever it might be at your firm, your organization. So you want to imagine yourself in that role and think about, what are the action steps that I would take? What would be different? How would I do things differently? And then you want to start acting, right, from that place. So first you want to embody that. Then you want to do the things so that you can create the results. Now, this is really, again, if we're thinking about the theme here, we're thinking smarter, not harder. So instead of thinking, well, how do I get the title, or how do I do this thing? We're looking at, who do you need to be in order to be selected for that role? And it really focuses your attention on the tangible steps that will have the most impact. And going back to some of the podcasts I've been listening to, there was, again, a line in one of the podcasts that Neville Goddard had produced, or it wasn't a podcast at the time, it was a speech or lesson. And he was talking about relationships and how when you change who you are in a relationship, with the way that you show up to the relationship, it has the capacity to change the dynamic of that relationship. And what he said was that by you showing up differently, you're not going to change the person that you're in a relationship with. We cannot change other people. But what happens is, if you change the way that you show up, the way that you're interacting, then if that other person has the capacity to respond differently, then that capacity will be revealed, and they will then in turn shift the way that they are relating to you. And so you might think about how this would apply in relationships that you have with other people. If you start to shift the way that you engage with someone who is perhaps a colleague, perhaps somebody who's in a personal relationship, when you change the way that you are in that relationship, then there's an opportunity for that person to also shift. And you may have seen that happen already, and it gives a frame to that experience that you've had in the past. You might experiment with this in the future and see how the way that you show up in a relationship impacts that other person. And what I like about this way of describing, because I've heard a million times, it takes two to tango. It's, only one sane person is required in a relationship for it to be a good relationship. I've heard a lot about how the individual in a relationship has so much influence, but I've never heard it explained in a way that sets a bit of a boundary. It sets a limit to the influence you can have. It's not like you change and that other person is magically going to become a different person and the relationship is going to be perfect or whatever. It's that the way that you're appearing in a relationship creates an opportunity. And you can think about this and how it aligns with the promotion opportunity. If you are in a firm or organization and you become the person who is suitable for that promotion, and for whatever reason that promotion does not occur, I can think of examples where in a firm, there may be a cap on the number of partners that are allowed in a particular practice group. And so you could be the ideal candidate, but there is not going to be a role for you until things shift, until the numbers actually change. So that could be an example where you can do your side of the equation, but if the capacity isn't there, it cannot reveal itself. If you're in a relationship with somebody who, I don't like to throw this word around, but is a narcissist, for example, and you do what you can to shift who you are in that relationship, and they, as a narcissist, are incapable of responding the way that you want them to or becoming the person that you want them to, then that is a limitation on that relationship. And you can then choose, do I want to be in this relationship? Do I want to be in this role, knowing that even when I show up as my best self or as the version of me that is doing everything that I can within my control to uphold my side of the equation, and there is still not going to be change on the other side, that is when you get to decide, do I want to stay here or do I want to move on? But you yourself have done the work. And going back to the idea of building yourself up and getting stronger and getting better, you have now gone through a process where by becoming that person, right, by thinking about who you want to become, you've done the work to get there. You now have evolved into that version of yourself. So I think that's a really neat model. Again, it's instead of the do, have, be model, I'm going to do the things, have the title so that I can be the person that I want to be or whatever that looks like for you. You want to start with a be. I want to be the person who does the thing, who then has the results. So again, I find that to be a really useful model. And for you, I'm hoping that also is something that resonates with you. So think about something that you're maybe putting off, a goal that you have, something for the future. If you were to already have that thing, what would be different for you? And then finally, that leads us to thinking strategy number 3. And this is really rooted in the idea of self-concept. So this isn't so much, I suppose it is somewhat related to some of the reading I've been doing recently, but this is more aligned with work that just comes up routinely for me in my coaching practice. The idea of a self-concept was never something that I had heard of until I became a coach. And even then, it was well into my coaching practice that I started to hear people talk about this, the self-concept. Some people talk about a self-image. Some people talk about metacognition, the ability to see oneself. And really what's going on here is that we consciously or unconsciously walk around with an idea of who we think we are, right? And for most people who don't think about self-concept every day like I do, it's so unconscious that you don't even notice that you're doing it. And the way that I see it in conversations that I have with people is they will simply give themselves labels and describe themselves as though what they were saying is true. They might say something like, oh, I'm so disorganized, or I struggle with a lack of confidence, or I never show up to appointments on time, or I just always lose things. And so there's also people who have the opposite, where the self-concept is really confident. Oh, I'm really good at dealing with people in a crisis situation, or I always know the right thing to say, or I always come prepared. So these are statements where when you think about what it is that that person is saying, they're giving themselves a label. And again, most of us are walking around with labels that we're not even aware of. And that is one of the really impactful things that you might find if you work with a coach, if you work with a counselor. You can even ask, can you highlight to me some of the things that I might be saying that I'm not even aware of? Because someone else will see it. I mean, you could do this with your friends, or you could ask your family members, you could ask your mother, your father, like, are there things that I seem to say about myself that I don't even register? And the reason this matters is that when you give yourself a label, when you give yourself a self-concept, then what happens, again, often at an unconscious level, is that you prove yourself to be true. And it's certainly what you notice. If you go around thinking, I'm a disorganized person, and labeling yourself as disorganized, then you're going to notice every time you do something that is not organized. And this is to do with the way that your brain is wired. You have this reticular activating system, which will notice. If you learn a new word, for example, you might notice that all of a sudden you see that word everywhere. It's because your reticular activating system has now registered that this is important. And so it starts to seek out examples of that. If you get a new car, you buy a new brand of jeans, whatever it happens to be, you just start to notice it everywhere. It's the same thing. If you're telling yourself on repeat that you are disorganized, that you struggle with confidence, that you're never on time, whatever, you're going to prove yourself true. So this can be helpful if the messaging, the labeling is a label that you like. It can also be really unhelpful if the label is something you don't like. And again, this is where it comes up a lot in coaching conversations where someone will describe themselves a certain way and we'll pause and we'll have a conversation about that. And this is where, again, kind of going back to what I alluded to earlier, is if you're focused on, let's say you are a disorganized person, you see yourself as a disorganized person and you want tools to become more organized, we don't necessarily want to start with the checklist of the things that you can do to be more organized. What we really want to start with is, okay, if you were that organized person, what would be different? How can you conceive of yourself as a more organized person? And then from that, we can figure out which action steps are going to follow. Because if we have a self-concept of someone who's disorganized, you can learn all the tools in the toolbook, but will you actually follow through and implement them? I think that's open to debate. So here, the idea then, the thinking smarter versus thinking harder challenge is to be really intentional about your self-concept. So instead of walking around with this label that isn't serving you, let's think about a better label that is actually one that leads you to the results you actually want to create. So what can we do here? Number one is to notice what you're telling yourself about yourself. This can be so subtle. Again, you might not even notice it, but when you've got that internal dialogue, pay attention to what you're saying. Are you telling yourself, oh, I always get it wrong, or I always take too long, or I never know where to start, or I always procrastinate? So what are you telling yourself? And again, if you like the label, if it aligns with your goals, then you can keep it. If you don't like it, then I'd invite you to challenge it. Let's get more factual. So one of the things you can do is if you've got a label, say it's a procrastinator, okay, so is it true that you're a procrastinator? And you might think about, yes, sometimes when I sit down to a task, it takes me 10 to 15 minutes to actually get started on that task because I tend to surf the internet or check my email. I get distracted. And so instead of saying I'm a procrastinator, you can narrow that down. Sometimes when I sit down, I do X, Y, and Z instead of the thing that I told myself I would do. And the reason that we want to get factual, and this applies really anytime you apply a blanket label, is because we want to drill down. We want to guard against black and white thinking. So if you find yourself saying, I always forget, or you're using this against somebody else, they're always late, they never listen to me, they always mess things up, they never follow instructions. When you're using that all or nothing language, you want to notice because chances are it's not 100% true all the time. And so let's pay attention to that. You might also think there's an element of exaggeration there. So you might take something that is relatively minor, something that happens once in a blue moon, and when you're saying it happens all of the time, you might really be engaging in that hyperbole, that exaggeration, and making a problem seem much bigger than it actually is. So I'm a hot mess, right? If that's what you're telling yourself versus I missed an email. It came in, it was midnight, I went onto my phone in the morning. I was scrolling through emails on the bus. I didn't see it. And now that I'm at the office and I'm kind of going back to my emails, I see that I missed this email yesterday. And so now I'm responding to it, whatever. But again, I'm a hot mess versus I missed an email. You can see how there's a big difference in terms of how that feels as a self-concept. Acknowledge that you're human. And of course, this is going to happen. So again, if we're looking at that label and the thing that we're doing, of course, sometimes I'm going to be disorganized. Sometimes I'm going to miss the email. Sometimes I will procrastinate. So it's not, I'm a procrastinator, that full on 100% label, those I am statements. When you label a person, when you label yourself, it's making it a lot more of a big deal than if you're just isolating that behavior. And you may have seen this if you're a parent and you've read parenting books, where your child goes off and does something that you don't want them to do. Your daughter hits her brother and you don't want to say you're a bad girl, but you might want to say what you did to your brother is wrong. Isolating the thing that's actually the problem, you're not making the person the problem. Another thing you want to do here then is we want to accept that this is the reality of being human. So again, going back to that idea that do we really want to get into this battle? Do you want to get into this battle with ourselves? Do you want to fight with yourself over whether or not you're a procrastinator? Well, I am a procrastinator because look at all these times that I didn't do this thing when I said I would. And, you're kind of strengthening that case against yourself. What if we just accept it? Yeah, I'm human. And sometimes I'm going to procrastinate. And then you can let it go and you can move on. So you might then ask yourself, okay, if I was organized, what would that organized person do? So again, if you were to adopt that label that you think you want, then what? How would your actions change based on that? So we've gotten factual then in terms of our first approach. Okay, we've got this label that we're giving ourselves. We're actually going to step away from that label. We're going to get really factual about what is actually going on here. We're going to accept that, yeah, sometimes I am going to be disorganized, and that is okay. And from there, we're just going to accept that this is how things are, and then we get to move on. We get to decide what we're going to do next. Now, another thing that you can do, if you've got this label, I'm a procrastinator, I'm disorganized, I lack confidence, then you can also ask yourself how the opposite is true. Again, this is going to help you to think more flexibly, to be able to look at a problem from multiple perspectives. And let's say it's procrastinating. You might also say, but look at all these other areas where I do not procrastinate. I know that I need to pick my child up from daycare. I never show up late. I always get there on time. Or whenever I've got a project that I really love, I always get to that project first. Or if I tell someone I'm going to deliver whatever it is by a certain date, I always meet my deadline. So you might think about areas where you actually are the opposite of what you're telling yourself. If you're telling yourself, I lack confidence, but then there are examples where you show up with tremendous amounts of confidence. You might show, well, actually, I'm really confident here. Or if you're telling yourself you're disorganized, you might also say, but look at all these other places where I am organized. I managed to show up at work every day. I managed to keep my children alive and fed and all of that. So you might think about how the opposite of the label is also true. And again, what we're doing here is we're looking at you from that self-concept level. And instead of applying this label that isn't serving you, right? This label that you're inadvertently living into, we're finding a different one. We're finding a better label, or at least we are challenging the one that you've given yourself. And then finally, what you can do here is to choose and define yourself in a way that serves you. So if we use organization as an example, instead of saying, I'm so disorganized, I'm a hot mess, whatever that sounds like to you, it might be, I am an organized person who sometimes loses track of things. I am a confident person who sometimes it feels self-doubt. I mean, if you think about the most confident people that you know, that you've ever met, very few of them, I imagine, ever or do not ever feel a sense of self-doubt in one situation or another. And so we just want to acknowledge, yeah, I'm a confident person who sometimes feels a sense of self-doubt. So that is the third strategy then. And just to recap, what we've talked about today is in terms of how you are approaching problems, how you are thinking about things in order to be more strategic in your thinking, in order to avoid rabbit holes and problems, self-sabotage, those types of things. Number one, we're going to notice where you are engaged in battle, which opponents are you strengthening inadvertently, and you are going to choose your battles carefully. That might mean that you notice a battle, you accept the problem as it is. Maybe you're acknowledging that there is truth in what somebody is saying, and then you are moving forward and you are refocusing your attention on the result that you want to create instead of investing your resources in the battle that you do not want to engage in. The second strategy is we're going to stop waiting for some external event that may or may not happen in the future in order for you to feel the way that you want to feel, in order for you to feel successful, to feel confident, to feel happy. And the strategies that you're going to use there is you're going to use that be, do, have model. You're going to imagine, let's say you already feel confident, you already feel happy, you already have the result that you want. What are you doing? So who are they being? What are they doing? And then what do they ultimately have as a result? So we use the promotion as an example. You want to think about, okay, so who would I need to be in that role? And then you think about the steps you would need to take, the things you would need to do, and then you would have that result. And sometimes you have that whole process, you go through the Be Do Have process. And, if you're in a relationship with a person, they may not have the capacity to give you what you want. If you're in a role that doesn't have opportunity for growth, there may not be capacity to go where you want to go. And so then you get to choose. Do you stay? Do you go? And then finally, we talked about being really attuned to your self-concept. So consciously or not, there is a running tape, an internal conversation where you are reinforcing a certain conception that you have of yourself. So is it a self-concept that aligns with who you want to be? And if not, let's get in there and make some shifts. Let's chip away at any labels that aren't serving you. And let's build up the evidence of the labels that do serve you. And from that place, with that self-concept, you will then be taking actions that align with that self-concept. So we talked about organization. So when you start to see yourself as an organized person, then when you go to take those action steps, when you take the tools of an organized person, you're now adhering those tools to the self-concept of a person who is aligned with the exercise of those tools. I hope you've enjoyed today's episode. I hope these mindset shifts, these thinking tools are sparking ideas within you. And I would love for you to reflect on which of these is most appealing to you, which one you'd want to try out first, and to give it a test. See how it works in your real life, whether that's at work, whether that's at home, and see the impact that it has, and to see where you are avoiding battles, where you are not putting off that feeling of satisfaction that you want to have, how you are relating to yourself differently as a result of shifting your self-concept, and to see the impact that that's having on you and on others in your world. So with that, I'm going to thank you for joining me this week. I hope you are having a beautiful summer. If you're listening to this when it goes live, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. I would love to hear from you. And I look forward to connecting with you again next week. That's all. Bye for now.
If you enjoyed today's show and don't want to miss an episode, subscribe and follow the show wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you haven't already, please leave a rating and review. Your feedback will help me create a podcast that's tailored to your needs and goes straight to the heart of what matters to you. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. If you want more information, visit www.thejoyfulpractice.com. See you next week.